At 33 years old, I spent my days as a senior data systems architect designing infrastructure that processed 400 million enterprise transactions every single day across 9 states. Yet when my younger brother stood up at his rehearsal dinner in front of 200 wealthy guests, he introduced me to his future father-in-law as the family failure. My mother, sitting right next to him, smiled and chimed in with her favorite line about how they simply did not brag about me. They had no idea that the multimillionaire investor funding my brother's entire lifestyle was currently licensing the exact software architecture I had built from scratch. Welcome back to Payback Stories. I'm Jennifer, and if you enjoy stories about family drama, betrayal, and karma finally catching up, make sure to hit subscribe and drop a comment. Let's get into it. The entire mess really started on a cold Tuesday night in late March, about 6 weeks before the wedding. I was sitting at the kitchen island in my Charlotte apartment, eating reheated soup, when my phone buzzed with a notification from a group chat I had been unceremoniously removed from 3 months earlier. The Miller family chat had suddenly added me back. There was no apology and no friendly greeting. My brother Brandon had simply sent a text that read, "Are you coming to the wedding or what? Don't make this weird." My mother Susan typed a message right below his, adding that Emily's family was extremely particular about headcounts and needed final numbers immediately. Emily Vance was Brandon's fiancée, and her father was Arthur Vance, a major venture capital investor whose firm Vance Capital had backed a dozen high-profile technology companies over the last few years. Everyone in my sector knew Vance Capital because they were one of the primary enterprise clients, licensing the core data routing architecture I had spent 6 years building at my company, Apex Systems. Below my mother's message, my father David typed a single line that said it would mean a lot to him if I showed up. That was the most my father had texted me in nearly 2 years. The thing you have to understand about the Miller family is that we only had room for one success story, and it certainly was not me. My brother Brandon had dropped out of a business master's program 4 years ago to launch Stratos Data, a cloud analytics startup that had managed to raise $11 million in seed funding and land on a few regional founder watch lists. I was just the quiet daughter who built back-end systems that nobody in my family cared to understand. The last time I had gone home for dinner in Gastonia back in January, my parents had invited our retired neighbors, the Johnsons. When Mrs. Johnson politely asked what I did for a living, my mother literally waved her hand in the air like she was swatting away a fly. She told Mrs. Johnson that I just did computer stuff or databases, then smiled and added her favorite phrase, explaining that they did not brag about me. She said it so casually, like mentioning they did not keep junk food in the house. Mrs. Johnson looked visibly awkward. My father studied his plate, and Brandon just leaned back in his chair with a smug grin. My mother spent the rest of that dinner reciting Brandon's achievements like a museum tour guide running through a list of exhibits. She talked about his angel investment rounds, his new office space in Raleigh, and his upcoming press mentions. What she conveniently left out was the fact that my parents had liquidated $140,000 from their retirement savings to cover a shortfall in his funding round. My father had admitted that detail to me months earlier during a quiet phone call, telling me they really believed in Brandon and had put in everything they had built up over 31 years of teaching and dental hygiene work. I did not argue with them back then because I had long since stopped expecting fairness from my family. At Apex Systems, my work spoke for itself. The primary system I had architected, named Nexus, was a real-time data orchestration engine that handled massive pipeline routing across logistics, healthcare, and financial networks. My colleague Jessica used to joke that I was the invisible backbone of the entire firm because I built the structure while other people got to take the bows. A few days after the group chat reopened, my company's CTO forwarded me an invitation to speak at a major data infrastructure summit in Atlanta later that spring. My name was featured on the program alongside 2 patents I co-authored, set to lead a panel on scalable pipeline design. I almost turned it down because I was so used to staying in the background that public recognition felt uncomfortable. My therapist had been telling me for months that I had organized my whole life around being hypercompetent while remaining completely unseen, and that it was costing me emotionally. I told her I would consider taking the speaking slot, then went back to my desk and optimized an automated failover protocol that saved our largest client 6 hours of potential downtime during an enterprise migration. Nobody sent me flowers or posted about it on social media, but seeing 0 errors across 9 routing nodes gave me the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. That had always been enough for me, or at least I had convinced myself it was. 2 weeks before the wedding, I drove down to Gastonia to drop off some replacement HVAC filters my father had asked me to pick up. I told myself I was just running an errand, but part of me was still hoping that my father's text message meant something deeper. When I walked into the living room, nothing had changed except for a new glass trophy sitting on the fireplace mantel that read Rising Founder 2025 from a local business journal. It sat right between a framed photo of Brandon shaking hands with an investor and a scented candle my mother had never lit. There was not a single photo of me anywhere in that house. Brandon was sitting at the kitchen table, eating a sandwich my mother had cut diagonally for him. He looked up at me, grinned, and said every family needed one success story and one cautionary tale. My mother laughed, my father stared down at his coffee, and I set the air filters on the counter. As I turned to leave, Brandon caught me near the front door and dropped his smile. He leaned in close and told me I needed to show up to the wedding because Emily's father was very traditional and wanted to see the whole family together. He warned me to just be normal and strictly instructed me not to talk about my job. Hearing my own brother tell me to hide the career I had built was infuriating, but it was not surprising given our history. For years earlier, Brandon had called me late at night in a complete panic 3 months after launching Strato's data. He had pitched several angel investors on a high-speed proprietary data routing engine, but he did not actually have one built. All he had was a flashy pitch deck, a leased office space, and a visual demo that ran on a basic spreadsheet macro. He begged me to build him a functional prototype, just so he could survive his initial investor demonstrations, promising he would hire a full engineering team once he secured his funding. My mother called me twice that same week urging me to help him out, and my father sent a rare text saying Brandon really needed my support. Because he was my brother, I agreed to help him. I spent 3 straight weeks building a fully functional backend prototype on my personal laptop during my off hours, completely separate from my employment at Apex. I used my own custom framework, my own naming structures, and my own logic patterns, writing clean and modular code because that was the only way I knew how to work. Brandon and I signed a simple consulting agreement where he agreed to pay me $10,000 and give me a co-architect credit on the technical documentation. In the end, he only paid me $1,500, and my name was never mentioned anywhere. 14 months later, Strato's Data publicly launched their core product, describing a proprietary data engine that was an exact replica of the framework I had built. He had simply renamed the system modules, adjusted the dashboard layout, and presented my architecture as his own brilliant invention. I never made a scene about it back then. My mother would have accused me of being bitter, my father would have shut down, and Brandon would have given me his usual line about how family is supposed to help family. I simply filed the signed consulting agreement, the commit logs, and the original technical specification away in a thick blue folder inside my desk drawer at home. That folder contained 47 timestamped code commits authored under my personal handle, 3 pages of hand-drawn system logic with my margin notes, and a printed email from Brandon asking me to make the demo work so he could handle the rest. I did not keep those documents to prepare a lawsuit. I kept them because I was an engineer who kept meticulous archives of every system I ever designed. It was the same habit that made me back up my servers to multiple locations and label every cable behind my desk. After returning from Gastonia, I opened that bottom drawer in my apartment and looked at the blue folder sitting under a stack of old tax returns. I ran my hand over the blue tape holding the cover together, then quietly shut the drawer. Whatever Brandon was pretending to build at his startup, and whatever money my parents had foolishly poured into it, was no longer my responsibility. I thought I had made my peace with being invisible to them. The following afternoon, I was eating lunch in the Apex break room with Jessica, telling her about the wedding invitation. She set her food down, looked at me like I had lost my mind, and asked why on earth I would attend an event for people who treated me like background furniture. I told her that something had shifted in me over the last few months, and that I was simply done making myself look small just so my family could feel tall. Jessica told me that sounded like a self-help quote, but she admitted I was right. I called my mother later that day to confirm I would be attending the wedding. She sounded relieved, though she immediately made it clear she was only concerned about the official seating chart. She reminded me not to wear anything that drew attention, urged me not to bring a date, and specifically told me not to mention my position at Apex Systems because Brandon got sensitive when people compared their achievements. The idea that my brother's empty marketing claims and my actual engineering career were even on the same level was absurd, but I kept my mouth shut and hung up the phone. 3 weeks before the big day, Brandon landed a full-feature article in a regional business magazine titled The Quiet Disruptor: How One Founder Built a Next-Generation Data Engine. I read the article on my phone during my morning break at work. The technical quotes Brandon gave to the reporter describing his engine were lifted almost word for word from the specification documents I had written 4 years ago in my apartment while eating takeout at 2 in the morning. The magazine article specifically noted that Strato's data was in final negotiations with Vance Capital for a major Series A investment round. Arthur Vance's fund was the exact entity evaluating Brandon's company, while simultaneously licensing Apex's software for their existing portfolio. Seeing my brother parade around in media interviews wearing my work like a custom suit was frustrating, but the absolute worst part was that the core technology actually functioned because I had built it properly. My mother proudly shared the article link in the family group chat along with a string of celebratory emojis, calling Brandon her brilliant boy. A dozen extended family members replied with glowing congratulations, while I simply muted the conversation and went back to work. That same week, Brandon appeared as a guest on a regional technology podcast. I sat at my desk and listened to 45 minutes of my brother describing technical systems he did not understand, using technical vocabulary he had memorized from my notes without having the slightest clue how the underlying logic functioned. He sounded remarkably confident and convincing, like a man who had recited a script so many times he had forgotten it was fiction. A few days later, my mother called me on a Thursday evening while I was reviewing load balancing code for an upcoming system update. She did not ask how my week was going. Instead, she used her tight, controlled tone to remind me how important Emily's family was, telling me Arthur Vance was a high-status man who noticed everything. She explicitly instructed me to be supportive at the venue, which meant staying quiet about technical topics and avoiding anything that might make Brandon feel like I was trying to compete with him. She asked me to just let my brother have his moment for once in his life. I wanted to ask her when I had ever tried to take anything away from him. I wanted to ask her why she and my father had gambled their entire retirement on a business they could not explain, and why she felt the need to diminish my career every time she spoke to relatives. But I stayed silent because I already understood her psychology. Susan Miller had grown up in a household where nobody went to college or accomplished much of anything, and she had spent her entire adult life terrified of being viewed as ordinary. She had chosen Brandon as her personal project to prove her own worth to the world, and if she ever admitted that I was the child who actually possessed real technical talent, she would have to face the fact that she had backed the wrong person for 30 years. 10 days before the wedding, the family group chat blew up again. Brandon sent an urgent message asking if I could quickly review some technical documentation before an important presentation. He did not say who the meeting was with, framing it as a quick family favor that would take less than an hour. Scrolling up through the chat history I had previously been excluded from, I saw venue photos, catering updates, and seating discussions I was never invited to join. Buried right between a note about floral arrangements and a menu update was a message Brandon had sent directly to my mother, telling her not to worry because I would not understand what was happening anyway since I only built basic backend stuff. The fact that he referred to the operational backbone of his entire company as basic backend stuff was almost funny. I replied to his request and told him to send the files over. He immediately emailed me a 6-page technical summary of his data architecture, which was clearly intended for Vance Capital's evaluation team. It took me less than 15 minutes to read through it. Brandon had gotten the high-level system overview mostly right because he was summarizing my original framework, but his performance numbers were completely fabricated and his throughput claims were exaggerated threefold. Furthermore, the section he labeled as his flagship proprietary innovation was actually a load distribution algorithm I had published in an open Apex white paper 2 years prior. He had built an elaborate corporate story around my engineering, positioning himself as a visionary founder, and now he wanted me to check his numbers before he handed the paperwork to his future father-in-law. I closed the document and did not bother sending a reply. The connection I should have made weeks earlier finally clicked on a Monday morning during a standard project status meeting at Apex. Our vice president of client accounts mentioned that Vance Capital had just officially renewed their enterprise license for our Nexus platform. She noted that Arthur Vance had personally reviewed our architecture documentation when they first signed their contract years ago, quoting him as saying it was some of the cleanest system design he had evaluated in his entire career. She looked right at me and reminded the room that I had been the lead architect on that build. I nodded and took a sip of my coffee without saying a word, but the dots suddenly connected in my mind. Arthur Vance knew Nexus inside and out, and he was currently preparing to invest millions into Stratos data. Stratos' engine was essentially a scaled-down derivative of Nexus, built on the exact same structural logic and naming patterns. If Arthur Vance's technical team ran any standard due diligence on Brandon's system, they were going to encounter code structures and variable naming conventions that matched Apex's framework at a foundational level, all credited to an author named Jay Miller. I sat with that realization for the rest of the day. It was not my job to police my brother's business ventures, nor was I looking to sabotage his funding round. If the truth came out through normal professional channels, that was between him and his investors. The proof was sitting inside the blue folder in my desk drawer, completely untouched. 2 weeks before the event, the family pressure escalated from casual dismissal to active management. Brandon sent me a direct text at 9 o'clock at night ordering me to arrive at the venue by 4 o'clock sharp, sit exactly where I was assigned, and make sure not to overdress or embarrass him in front of Emily's family. He was attempting to manage me like an unwanted glitch in his master plan. A night later, my father called me directly. It was the first time he had initiated a private conversation with me in over a year, and his voice sounded heavy and anxious. He told me that he and my mother had everything riding on this wedding and Brandon's business, reminding me that they had put in their entire savings. Hearing the desperation in his voice made me feel a profound sense of sadness. My parents were in their 60s, and they had gambled their financial future on a company built on borrowed code and inflated metrics, completely oblivious to the fact that the daughter they ignored was the only person who actually understood how fragile their gamble really was. On Wednesday morning, an unexpected message landed in my LinkedIn inbox. It was a formal connection request, followed by a note from a man named Tyler Scott, who identified himself as a senior technical analyst at Vance Capital. The message was professional and direct, stating that his firm was currently conducting a technical assessment on a portfolio candidate in the data infrastructure space. Tyler explained that during their code audit, his team had identified architectural patterns and module structures that aligned almost identically with published system documentation attributed to my work on Nexus at Apex Systems. He asked if I would be willing to schedule a brief call that week to clarify the provenance and original authorship of those foundational components as part of their standard due diligence process. I read the message 3 times while sitting at my desk. My heart rate stayed completely steady, but I opened my bottom desk drawer, pulled out the blue folder, and set it flat on the table. Inside was the signed consulting agreement bearing Brandon's hurried signature alongside my neat one, dated 4 years ago. Beside it were the 47 time-stamped commit logs, the handwritten architecture notes with the coffee stain on the second page, and Brandon's email begging me to fix his demo. The folder was not a weapon I had created to hurt my family. It was simply a careful record of my professional work. I realized then that I was facing a straightforward decision. If I confirmed my authorship to Vance Capital's analyst, their team would flag Stratos Data's intellectual property as unresolved. An unresolved IP flag during a Series A round would instantly freeze the investment, potentially destroying the deal entirely. My family would inevitably blame me, with my mother claiming I acted out of deep-seated jealousy and Brandon telling everyone I sabotaged his dream. I looked at the cursor blinking on my computer screen for a long time. I opened a basic text document and typed out a single rule for myself. I will not lie about my own work. That was my bottom line. I was not going to call Vance Capital out of nowhere to expose my brother, nor was I going to show up at his office demanding credit. But if an institutional investor asked me a direct question about software I wrote with my own hands, I was going to tell the absolute truth. I was not going to commit fraud or compromise my professional integrity to preserve a lie my family had spent years constructing. I typed a brief response to Tyler Scott, letting him know I was available for a call on Thursday afternoon. The rehearsal dinner took place at an upscale vineyard venue about 40 minutes outside Charlotte, complete with long tables, white linens, and delicate overhead string lighting. I found my place card at a table tucked near the kitchen service doors, situated next to a distant cousin I had not spoken to in 5 years and a friend of Emily's who spent the entire evening looking at her phone. Brandon and Emily sat at the main head table alongside Arthur Vance and his wife Margaret, while my parents sat at an adjacent table close by. When it came time for speeches and introductions, Brandon stood up and worked the room with practiced ease. He introduced his parents with great warmth and paid glowing tribute to Emily's family. When he reached my table, he paused, pointed in my direction, and announced to the room that I was his sister Jennifer, who worked with computers. A few guests offered polite smiles, while a gray-haired man sitting at a nearby corner table tilted his head slightly upon hearing my name, looking at me with a quiet sense of recognition. After the speeches concluded, guests began moving toward the outdoor patio. The gray-haired man from the corner table walked past where I was standing and stopped. He politely asked if I was Jennifer Miller, inquiring if I was the same systems architect who had authored the paper on scalable data orchestration presented at the Regional Engineering Conference. I nodded and confirmed that I was. He offered a small, knowing smile, handed me his business card, and walked out toward the terrace. Someone in that room had recognized my professional credentials for something that had absolutely nothing to do with my brother's startup. On the drive home that night, the full picture became crystal clear to me. Brandon had not invited me to his wedding because he genuinely wanted his sister there. He needed to present a complete, picture-perfect family to Arthur Vance, but more importantly, he needed me to appear as small and insignificant as possible. If my name ever came up during Vance Capital's technical audit, Brandon wanted Arthur to remember me as a quiet relative who worked a low-level IT job, ensuring that any claims I might make about his code would sound like the bitter complaints of an unsuccessful sibling. What Brandon failed to realize was that Vance Capital's audit team was already reviewing my records, and the primary author flagged in their report was not a bitter relative. She was a respected senior architect sitting in the room, quietly eating dinner while being presented as the family failure. The confrontation was coming entirely on its own momentum, driven by the simple fact that I was no longer willing to cover for him. The wedding ceremony the next afternoon was held at the Vance family estate, a sprawling 22-acre property featuring a grand stone manor house and a massive reception hall with high ceilings and polished marble flooring. Everything about the venue radiated quiet wealth. I arrived at 4 o'clock sharp, wearing a simple navy dress I had purchased 2 years ago for a conference. My mother would have preferred I wear something completely unremarkable that blended into the background, but I chose a dress I liked because I was finished dressing for her approval. The ceremony itself was brief and elegant. Emily looked stunning, while Brandon looked like a man who had carefully rehearsed every emotion for the cameras. My parents sat in the front row looking immensely proud, having invested their financial future and personal pride into the occasion. I sat 4 rows back between guests I did not know, quietly watching my brother exchange vows with the daughter of the man evaluating his business. The reception began at 6 o'clock in the main hall. The guest tables were arranged in neat rows surrounding a central dance floor, and my assigned seat was at table 11, located at the far perimeter near a side exit and a decorative plant. Brandon had personally arranged the seating chart, finding me near the bar earlier to tell me with a smirk that table 11 was a fantastic spot because I could see the entire room. In reality, it was a spot where nobody would notice me. Brandon took my arm in a performative gesture and began guiding me through the crowd of guests, using me as a backdrop for his personal display. He introduced me to Emily's aunt as his sister, who worked in IT support, introduced me to a groomsman as the quiet bookworm who never left her desk, and told another couple that I was the family introvert. Every single introduction was a calculated put-down wrapped in a polite smile. My mother walked behind us, nodding approvingly at every comment, while my father looked down at the floor. When Emily's mother asked me about my career, my mother jumped into the conversation before I could speak, telling her I did basic tech support. I let the comment sit without creating a scene, but when Brandon squeezed my shoulder and whispered for me to just relax because nobody cared, I stepped back and pulled my arm away. I looked him dead in the eye and told him very clearly that he could introduce me, but he was not going to script me. He blinked in surprise, flashed his usual defensive grin, told me not to take things so seriously, and walked off toward the head table. I stood my ground, quietly drinking my water and waiting for the evening to play out. Arthur Vance entered the reception hall around 6:30 after finishing formal photographs with the bridal party. His presence immediately shifted the tone of the room. He was a tall man with silvering hair at his temples, carrying himself with the calm authority of someone accustomed to making major financial decisions. Emily pulled him over to the table where my parents were sitting, where Brandon was already speaking loudly about Stratos Data's latest corporate expansion. Arthur listened quietly without nodding or interrupting, observing Brandon with the steady focus of an investor evaluating a risky asset. I was standing near the edge of the bar area when Brandon noticed me and saw an opportunity to demonstrate his dominance. He called out to Arthur, telling him he needed to meet his sister. He reached over, grabbed my arm, and pulled me directly into their group. My mother sat up straight in her chair, my father set his glass down, and Brandon faced Arthur Vance with a wide, confident smile. Standing right in front of the man holding the key to his company's future, Brandon gestured toward me and announced clearly that I was the family failure. He let out a loud laugh, clearly expecting the rest of the group to join in. A few nearby guests offered uncomfortable chuckles, and my mother leaned forward to add her rehearsed line, telling Arthur's wife that they simply did not brag about me. She said it with her usual breezy tone, presenting it as a modest family joke. My father stared intently at his plate while Brandon kept his hand firmly on my shoulder. I did not flinch, shrink back, or smile to soften the moment. I stood with my posture straight, my arms resting naturally at my sides, and my face completely composed. Arthur Vance did not laugh. He looked at Brandon, looked at my mother, and then slowly turned his gaze directly to me. His expression tightened as he studied my face, his eyebrows drawing together in concentration. The room around us seemed to quiet down as Arthur looked at me with clear recognition. He spoke in a low, distinct voice that carried across the surrounding tables, stating that he recognized me and calling the meeting entirely unexpected. Brandon's confident smile instantly froze on his face. My mother set her champagne glass down on the table, and Arthur's wife looked at her husband with an expression of sharp attention. Brandon tried to keep his smile intact, asking Arthur if they somehow knew each other. Arthur ignored Brandon completely and addressed me directly, calling me Ms. Miller and asking if I was the architect behind the Nexus platform at Apex Systems. I nodded calmly and confirmed that I was. Arthur noted that my system architecture was currently running across 11 of his firm's major portfolio companies. I corrected him gently, pointing out that it was actually 12 since MedSync had migrated to our platform in January. Arthur's jaw tightened as the reality of the situation set in. He noted aloud that his lead analyst, Tyler Scott, had flagged a major software provenance issue during their technical review the previous week, adding that he had initially assumed the J. Miller listed in the code records was an independent contractor or a coincidence. He looked back and forth between Brandon and me, asking if I was telling him that I was Brandon's sister. I confirmed that I was. Arthur then asked directly if I was the person who had written the foundational code modules that Stratos Data's entire product was built upon. I did not hesitate or offer excuses. I told Arthur directly that I had written the original system architecture 4 years ago under a private consulting agreement, adding that the time-stamped commit history was entirely mine. I explained that the code had been developed on my own personal time outside my employment at Apex, and that the intellectual property had never been formally assigned or transferred to Stratos Data because the original contract terms were never fulfilled. The immediate area around our table went completely silent. Brandon stepped directly between Arthur and me, his body language turning defensive and frantic. He raised his voice, telling Arthur that I was exaggerating the situation and claiming I had merely helped with an early, basic prototype. He insisted that everything Stratos Data was today was built entirely by his current team and his personal vision, claiming I had only written a few basic lines of code years ago. He looked at Arthur with a desperate version of his usual grin, claiming that family members always thought they contributed far more than they actually did. Arthur raised his hand slightly, cutting Brandon off mid-sentence. He noted that the module architecture in Stratos' engine-matched apexes published design patterns at a structural level, adding that his analyst's report had identified identical variable names, dependency trees, and routing logic. Arthur then asked Brandon to explain the specific load distribution algorithm used in his core pipeline. Brandon froze. He opened his mouth, stammered for a moment, and claimed that his technical team handled the specific details while he focused on high-level corporate strategy. Arthur remained completely calm and precise, asking Brandon if he could describe how his proprietary algorithm handled latency thresholds. Brandon stood there in complete silence, looking at me with total panic as he ran completely out of excuses. My mother stood up from her chair, nervously telling Arthur that this was a private wedding celebration and not the appropriate venue for business discussions. My father quietly told my mother to sit down and be quiet, marking the first time he had spoken up all evening. She stopped in her tracks and stared at him in shock. Arthur turned his focus back to me and asked a direct question, inquiring if the core software engine of Stratos data was entirely my original work. I answered him clearly and professionally, stating that the core framework was based on a prototype I built over 3 weeks 4 years ago using my own design specifications. I explained that the commit history was entirely registered to my account, that I had never been paid in full, and that no formal assignment of intellectual property had ever taken place. I delivered the facts plainly, without raising my voice or showing emotional distress. Brandon's face flushed bright red with fury. He shouted at me, asking how I could do this at his wedding and accusing me of planning the entire confrontation to destroy his big day. I told him calmly that he had invited me to the venue, introduced me to his lead investor, and that I had simply answered a direct professional question with documented facts. I stated firmly that I would not lie about my own work for anyone. Brandon turned back to Arthur, claiming I was just bitter and jealous of his corporate success. Arthur cut him off with administrative finality, stating that if the core technology of the company was not properly owned by the entity, Vance Capital could not proceed with the investment. He noted plainly that it was not a personal issue, but a fundamental matter of legal due diligence. My mother looked entirely pale, staring at me as if she were seeing me for the first time in her life. The surrounding guests had stopped their conversations, watching the complete collapse of Brandon's carefully constructed narrative in real time. What followed over the next hour was a quiet, methodical unwinding of my brother's business. Arthur Vance formally stepped away from the conversation, joining his wife and daughter at another table to discuss the situation privately. Brandon stood near the head table, looking completely defeated as the reality of his lost funding round hit him. He did not smash any glasses or create a physical scene. Instead, he simply sat down in a chair with his head in his hands, unable to face the guests he had been bragging to hours earlier. My mother hurried over to Arthur, desperately trying to explain that I had always been difficult and competitive, pleading with him not to let a family misunderstanding ruin the deal. Arthur listened politely before informing her that my technical reputation in the software industry was exceptionally high, adding that her characterization of my work was completely inaccurate based on industry standards. My mother stood there speechless, unable to argue against documented professional facts. Later in the evening, as guests began to filter out of the venue, my father approached me near the entrance hallway. His tie was loosened, and his eyes were full of stress. He quietly asked me about the $140,000 they had invested, asking if their retirement money was completely lost. I told him gently that I did not know, but that it depended entirely on whether Stratos data could survive without Vance Capital's funding round. He leaned against the wall, looking exhausted and far older than his years. For a moment, I felt a deep sense of pity for my parents, recognizing that their desperation to present a successful image had led them to make a catastrophic financial decision. My mother walked up to us a moment later, her voice trembling with anger as she told me I should have just stayed quiet and protected the family. I looked at her and told her that she had spent 10 years treating me like I did not exist and that I owed her nothing. She opened her mouth to argue, but realized she had no ground left to stand on and turned away. As I walked out toward the parking lot, Arthur Vance caught up with me under the front entryway. He apologized for not recognizing my name earlier on the analyst reports, acknowledging that my engineering work spoke for itself. He confirmed that Vance Capital was officially withdrawing from the investment round due to the unresolved ownership issues, noting that the decision was purely a matter of proper risk management. I thanked him for his professionalism, shook his hand, and walked to my car. Within 72 hours of the wedding, Vance Capital formally issued their withdrawal notice to Stratos Data. Without the endorsement of Arthur Vance's firm, two other prospective angel investors pulled out of negotiations within a week. The regional business journal that had previously praised Brandon ran a brief follow-up note highlighting the failed funding round and the unresolved technology rights. Stratos Data did not vanish overnight, but without clean title to its software or fresh capital, the business rapidly shrank into irrelevance. Emily Vance officially postponed the wedding events, moved back into her family's residence, and quietly ended her relationship with Brandon a few weeks later. In the family group chat, my father eventually sent me a private text asking if I was doing okay. My mother did not send a message for several days, finally typing a short note claiming I could have handled things differently. I replied once, stating clearly that I was willing to maintain a relationship with them only if it was built on mutual respect and honesty, and that I would no longer accept being treated as an afterthought. Neither of them replied, which was perfectly fine with me because I was no longer seeking their validation. The following Monday, I returned to my office at Apex Systems. The Nexus platform was operating smoothly, processing hundreds of millions of transactions without a single error. Jessica sat down next to my desk with a fresh cup of coffee, looked at me, and noted that I looked like someone who had finally dropped a heavy burden. I smiled and agreed with her. Later that afternoon, I opened my email and officially accepted the invitation to keynote the Data Infrastructure Summit in Atlanta. I had spent a decade building systems that held together entire industries, all while my family dismissed my worth because I did not shout about my achievements. I finally understood that my professional value and my personal worth were never dependent on my family's approval. The blue folder remained safely archived in my desk drawer, not as a symbol of conflict, but as proof of the solid foundation I had built for myself. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Payback Stories for a new family drama story every day, and I'll see you in the next one.